when the enhanced child tax credit expired back in December, that was basically the end of the government throwing a bone to working people during a catastrophic public health crisis and economic downturn. Over the course of the pandemic, more than 22 million people lost jobs in the first few months alone. Workers around the world lost an estimated $3.7 billion in earnings, food insecurity spiked, and according to one poll, almost 20% of US households lost their entire savings. And yet, from the start, Republicans and plenty of Democrats complained bitterly about having to slightly loosen the purse strings for the American public during a national emergency. Recall that Republicans fiercely opposed both stimulus checks and enhanced unemployment benefits. More recently, of course, Joe Manchin torpedoed Biden's spending bill in part because he claimed parents would spend their monthly child tax credit checks on drugs. Of course, none of these politicians had anything to say whatsoever about the massive upward transfer of wealth during the pandemic. We now know that billionaires made a combined $5 trillion during the pandemic, thanks mostly to the wild fluctuations of the stock market. Bernie Sanders, for his part, called for a one-time tax on this obscene amount of wealth, of course, to no avail. But also recall that the same CARES Act that contained the apparently controversial relief checks and supplemental unemployment benefits also contained tax breaks in the billions for real estate developers and other businesses, and delivered a $25 billion bailout to the airline industry on the grounds that airlines wouldn't lay off or furlough their workers or use the money to buy back stocks. Spoiler, the airlines furloughed workers anyway. The same goes for the Paycheck Protection Program, which was theoretically supposed to supplement workers' incomes during the pandemic, but ended up being mostly a giveaway to the upper class. Recently, a group of researchers looked into how the program's money had been spent during the pandemic, and as lead author David Autor told the New York Times, quote, "We tried to figure out where did the money go, and it turns out it didn't primarily go to workers who would have lost jobs. It went to shareholders and their creditors." The Times write-up continues, "For every $1 in wages that the Paycheck Protection Program prevented from being lost, it handed out $3.13 that went somewhere else. 72% of the program's relief money ended up in the hands of those whose household income is in America's top 20%, Dr. Autor's group found." So, in other words, while policymakers on both sides of the aisle constantly nickel and dime working people when it comes to social spending, they have absolutely no problem at all shoveling money at businesses and the wealthy. This, of course, is what Bernie Sanders, by way of Martin Luther King Jr. and others, famously calls socialism for the rich.
While we are on the subject of socialism for the rich, which my Republican friends have suddenly become very concerned about, let me talk about the Trump tax proposal that was pushed very hard by Senator McConnell and the Republican leadership, and where I think every Republican voted for it. You want to talk about socialism for the rich? It is not the bill that puts $2,000 into working class hands all over this country. That ain't socialism for the rich. This is socialism for the rich in that bill. Amazon, oh, by the way, I must say this if I may, we were quoting the liberal Washington Post owned by Jeff Bezos, the wealthiest guy in the world. So here is Jeff Bezos' company, Amazon, and they received a tax rebate. They paid nothing in 2018 in federal taxes. That's a corrupt tax system to begin with. But then on top of that, they received $129 million as a tax rebate. That, Senator Thune, is what socialism for the rich. In fact, this particular company is owned by the richest guy in the world. You gave him a $129 million rebate.
So why exactly do politicians continue to give handouts and cut taxes for businesses and billionaires, aka practice socialism for the rich? Yes, part of it is that politicians, particularly those with ties to big business, are very often just greedy or corrupt. Former Representative Beto O'Rourke recently noted as much when he tried to slam Texas Governor Greg Abbott as a kind of corporate socialist for doling out favors to his friends in Texas. Beto tweeted, "Abbott is a corrupt socialist. He encouraged his corporate buddies to make obscene profits during the grid failure and forced us to pay for their windfall in higher utility bills. He privatized the gains to a few and socialized the losses to every single ratepayer in Texas. So, Beto has a point that whenever the government decides to subsidize the activities of businesses, it's middle and working class taxpayers who are inevitably left holding the bag for any risks and losses those businesses end up incurring. But the system of so called socialism for the rich isn't only the product of cronyism or politicians scratching the backs of their corporate friends. It's literally what our current stage of capitalism requires. Under capitalism, politicians have a perpetual incentive to prioritize economic growth. So, simply put, in order to stay in office, they generally have to be able to point to a healthy and growing economy. For most voters, a good economy means low unemployment and low inflation. And for businesses, it of course means increased profit. So when politicians can't deliver on those things, they risk losing their jobs, particularly because big businesses and wealthy individuals, who are the ones who are most invested in economic growth because they have the most to gain from it, hold disproportionate influence over our political system. So if policymakers essentially have to ensure economic growth to keep their jobs, how do they do it? In the post war era, they did it with generous public spending and by heavily regulating business activity, which kept both wages and productivity high. The rate of economic growth during this period was, in fact, the fastest the US has ever seen. Unfortunately, this era of turbocharged economic growth couldn't last forever, and once it began to slow down in the 1970s, big business saw an opportunity to push what we now call neoliberal restructuring or just trickle down economics. In short, over the last 40 years, under the new regime of neoliberalism, policymakers have almost exclusively tried to stoke economic growth through massive tax cuts, breaking unions, deregulating the financial sector, and slashing the social safety net, all in the hopes that if these measures juice business profits, those same businesses might reinvest said profits in the economy by creating jobs, raising wages, and buying or producing goods, equipment, or technology that could theoretically increase labor productivity. However, as we now know, a curious thing happened. Even though corporations were increasingly relieved of high tax burdens and pesky unions, and their profits started skyrocketing again, they did not reinvest those profits the way everyone said they would. Instead, they mostly funneled the money into massive CEO compensation packages and stock buybacks, or just flat out offshored the profits. And as it happens, the effect of their refusal to invest has been sluggish GDP for the US since the 1980s. So this graph here shows change over time. So yes, you can see there has been some economic growth over the last several decades, but the rate has been significantly slowing down over that time period. Now, all of this only got worse in the wake of the Great Recession. As the economist David Kotz put it, since 2007, capitalists have largely failed to carry out their, quote, historical mission of using their profits to invest in superior methods that raise the productivity of human labor. With slow productivity growth, the only means of rapid profit growth is driving down wages and benefits of workers and or further reducing corporate taxation. So, what this all means is that we can't put an end to socialism for the rich simply by weeding out corrupt politicians or even by electing a few more Democrats, because socialism for the rich, so to speak, is a fundamental component of our economic system. At the end of the day, if capitalists are not reinvesting their profits in the economy and in society, and if no amount of further tax cutting or deregulation can convince them to do so, the solution for kickstarting the economic growth that everybody wants so much clearly has to be public investment. To quote David Kotz again, the best future path for working people in the United States would be some version of green social democracy. Socialism is not on the political agenda at this time. However, a period of green social democracy has the potential to at least slow global warming to stave off the danger of disastrous global climate change. It would also bring significant improvements for working people, young people, people of color, and other popular constituencies. So, in other words, we know that public goods like single payer healthcare, free childcare, paid leave for parents, and free higher education all stand to make life better for the vast majority of Americans, particularly during and after economic downturns like the Great Recession and the pandemic. But Kotz also points out that strong public investment doesn't just give working people more resources and more say over their lives. As we know from the post-war era, it can also bring about the kind of balanced growth of wages and profits that neoliberalism is now incapable of producing. which is all to say that green social democracy might even be good for the economy. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.